Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining in the session today, which is going to be looking at covering learning outcome 2, for the unit, which is managing quality in health and social care. Now, for some of you who are joining the session today and haven't joined the first one, there is a recording of the first session covering the perspectives of quality in relation to health and social care on YouTube, and there are subsequent presentations which I put up on Moodle that should be easily accessible as you go about, reading or self-studying this particular unit. The sessions that we're doing are in addition to, obviously the material which is available on Moodle, and I would like to just briefly, showcase or at least show you the material which is available that you would be able to access with regards to, the Moodle. So if I just share the screen on the learning management system, if you go on from healthcare, choose your course, which is level 5 diploma in health and social care, HSCM. And when you're in the course, if you scroll down, you will see the unit 5.18, which is quite down. If I go down, so this is the unit that we are looking at reading currently, which is managing quality in health and social care. I had initially opened up the unit specification, which is the first document. If I click on this, this is the one that we are following through in terms of, obviously teaching this particular unit. And today we are looking at discussing learning outcome 2, which is to understand the strategies, which are required for achieving, quality in health and social care services. And there are 3 assessment criteria. The first one talks about, standards that we will look at, some of the agencies, regulatory agencies which are in this particular sector, specifically CQC, NICE, the King's Fund, Public Health England. We have a couple of other agencies which typically look at setting the standards. We'll be discussing them in a bit more detail. The second assessment criteria in learning outcome 2 talks about different approaches to implementing quality systems. So here we're going to be looking at different approaches. How do organizations go about implementing a particular type of quality management system within the organization? But this part of it will be slightly theoretical because we're looking at general approaches, and then we are going to contextualize it to applying it to the health and social care sector. The third one talks about analyzing potential barriers to delivery of quality services in health and social care. So obviously, if quality standards are not maintained, if legislation and regulatory compliances are not met, policies and procedures are not followed, what you generally get to see is that there are slippages in quality and care. And in slippages in quality then lead to slippages in the type of care being provided in a particular setup. And that is what we will look at. What will be the potential barriers? So barriers in terms of, staff not being trained, or for example, implementation of policies and procedures not being done, or in some cases, barriers could be that the policy and procedures have not been updated over a point in time. There are no regular audits which are done. Risk mitigation is not done, and they could tend to potentially cause barriers in implementing the quality of health and social care services. So we'll be looking at learning outcome 2 in a bit more detail. What I've done and gone ahead and do is basically looked at, uploading all the presentations, which is learning outcome 1, 2, learning outcome 3 and 4. And there are some additional handouts and documents that I've uploaded, which primarily should be helpful for you to understand these specific learning outcome 2, because here we are looking at strategies, for achieving, quality in health and social care. So I've downloaded the NHS, framework, which is primarily developed for quality, how quality is going to be maintained and, implemented through across the NHS. This is a revised document downloaded from the .gov website, and a lot of material that I'm going to be looking at speaking to you about in the slides is going to come from this particular handout, which is a quite a large and a detailed handout, but it's a good one because there are some sections of the handout which basically explain what is the national framework, and obviously because we're looking at standards that exist in delivery of health and social care, there are 4 or 5 broad parameters that we will look at, which are picked up from this document. The other bit which I'll also say, which some of you should be looking at, is the aspect of the NHS Constitution. A lot of you who are studying this particular course at some stage, would need to understand the NHS Act of 2010, the NHS Constitution, which obviously looks at, laying down the foundations of how, care is delivered, provided, how integrated care model is basically delivered and provided using different clinical commissioning groups, hospitals, surgeries, and various such outlets which basically look at providing services in terms of health and social care to the members of public. This is a very good document, a very good summarized document, which I would suggest that a lot of you should look at reading as a document which will give you insight into the National Health Service. What are the key frameworks, the principles, the standards, how they've been set, the vision and mission of NHS, and obviously how they are, how quality of care is implemented and integrated into the NHS Constitution in terms of putting people first approach, the 6 C's, and the person-centered approach. And they are all going to be covered in a bit more detail in this particular document. Now, I'm going to take you back to, obviously, the learning outcome 2 that we are looking at discussing today. And there's a fair bit of content in the learning outcome that we are going to be looking at for discussion. So over to the presentation slides, in which what I will do is obviously discuss some of these main points of the indicative content, things like what are standards, how they are set, what are the key legislations and code of practice which are important for us to make sure that quality policies and procedures are followed in terms of delivery of care within the sector. And then the second one in particular talks about implementation of how do we look at doing the implementation of quality and quality related policies within a particular setup. And then finally we'll be looking at barriers that can come up if there is say, for example, interagency working, if the legislation and policies and processes are not implemented correctly, training and development is not adequately done for the staff, and then obviously if staff performance levels are not monitored regularly, then there could be slippages in terms of how care is being delivered to the patients, and in this case, members of the public. Now, before I start, I want to look at very briefly 1 or 2 things which is related to what is quality, and what is the when I say quality, this is something that I want to look at in terms of the context of health and social care. So when we talk about quality in the context of health and social care, what do we mean by that? Now, when we talk about implementing quality and the word quality comes in, we are basically looking at 2 or 3 things, and 2 or 3 words should come to your mind. And the first is safe and effective care is to be provided to patients when we talk about quality. So when we talk about quality in the context of the meaning of quality from a World Health Organization perspective refers to safety, and it refers to safe and effective practices which can be used to deliver services to members of public. Now, when we talk about quality from a point of view of people-centered approach, there's a slide reference here, because here we are looking at taking into account the 6 underlying principles, of person-centered approach, which includes safety, timeliness, equality. We are looking at efficiency, and we are looking at obviously, bits and pieces related to the, things like dignity, individuality, compassion, things like that. Now, when we are looking at, talking about quality of care, in particular, when we talk about quality of care, what we are looking at is we are looking at defining it, the degree to which health services for individuals and populations are provided to the desired levels, and they are consistent with the rules and regulations set by the regulator in a particular geography, and they would be classed as, obviously looking at providing, quality services, or would be looking at quality. Now, why is it important? I think it is quite clear that why is it important is because of the fact that we need to be able to ensure that care being provided is personalized and is meeting the requirements of the patient. It is helping the patient get rid of a chronic disease, or maybe the care which is being provided is helping the patient to get better. And the care being provided is being provided using the patient-centered or person-centered model, which primarily is putting, or in other words, the putting people first philosophy, wherein you're looking at being responsive to patients' needs and preferences. You're looking at empowering patients with information and enabling that they are able to, take independent decisions. You're also respecting their individuality, their dignity, and you're dealing with them with respect. Now, this particular aspect of quality of care is important because this is the core philosophy under which all services, from the National Health Service are provided, to members of public. Now, we could also say to a certain extent that when we talk about quality, quality is also important is because there are continuous improvements which have to be done in providing some of these services to the patient, and the monitoring of these services over a period of time, which helps in the improvement of these services, will essentially be the remit of quality, and they will all be coming under quality. Now, in order to emphasize this in terms of, what is quality in social care, health and social care in particular, I'm going to look at showing you a video, which is a video, developed by SCIE, Sky, and this video basically looks at, it's a compilation of, I would say, a couple of things in terms of how quality is important in variety of different settings within health and social care, and some of the key people involved in the delivery of this, care. When we look at standards being set, they are taken into account from an aspect of looking at this particular video. So there are, important bits which will be explained in terms of what is quality, how is it related to social care. And there is an example in particular that I would want you to see, which talks about how quality is being, taken into account while delivering these services to a particular patient in a care home. Now, the video is about 19 minutes long because they have taken different settings, and the examples have been included from different settings within the health and social care sector. But we'll be looking at one in particular as an example to, kind of lay the foundation of what we're going to discuss in Learning Outcome 2. And I would encourage you to watch the full video after the session on your own, in order to ensure that, this is something that is clearly understood, and the role of quality in the delivery of health and social care services is clearly understood. So let me, play the video and let's listen in.
To improve quality in social care, it helps to understand what the best possible quality looks like, over and above the standards required by law. Sky brought together the best available evidence to help identify the key ingredients of excellent care and support. Sky's review of the evidence concluded that excellent services put people who use services in control, help them to sustain good relationships, and to spend time on activity that's meaningful to them. In this film, we brought together a panel of experts, including people who use services, to discuss what excellence means in a supported living setting. First, let's meet the panel. Anne Netton is a professor of social welfare who helped define excellence for the Social Care Institute for Excellence. Julie Beadle-Brown is a reader in Intellectual and Development Disability at the University of Kent. Dorothy Runnacles uses social care services and is a campaigner for older people. And Pat Charlesworth, a self-advocate and champion for people with learning disabilities. Today our panel will analyse a series of clips of social care in action, all taken from the Social Care TV archive, and they'll discuss examples of excellence.
When I went to assess Marjorie in her previous care home, I saw a lady who was sitting quietly in her own room. She didn't engage much with me in conversation. Her son had told us that she used to play the organ in the local church and had a lot of pleasure, and that music had been a very important part of her life. Have a go, have a go. Have a go, Joe. Have a go. We then decided that we would try and sit with her for a very short period each day and see if she could pick up tunes again. So we would sing a hymn to her, and she started again picking up those tunes and playing some of those favourite hymns. It's given her back some of her dignity. This afternoon she's actually going out to a concert with a volunteer, and we think that she'll really enjoy that. It would be very easy for us to forget that our residents are individual people with their own personal history and their own background and their own things that they'd like to do and that they've been proud of. If I were ill, or if my mother was ill, I would want people to remember who she was, what her background was, the things that she used to like to do. And that's very important for us here at our house. Indeed, the whole process goes much more smoothly if we treat people as individuals.
The clip leads the panel to discuss person-centred care.
They actually recognised that she had previous life, that she wasn't just a number in a room somewhere. And I wondered how often this lady would be taken out, because that's what excellence is about, is sustaining a better practice, not just a one-off.
Family background is really important to keep the link with the families, otherwise you just don't know where people have come from.
But then they had to find a way of resourcing that, and actually, so they managed to find a kind of volunteer.
Volunteer was really enjoying the music as well, which is great.
So it was a shared interest, it's something she was enjoying, and if volunteering things to work, then finding people who will enjoy the same things is important to do.
One resident who posed a dilemma for the staff was Des. Des had come to the home on a high dose of antipsychotics because of challenging behaviour.
He was very unsettled, very angry with life, and he used to pick up the furniture, pile it in the middle of the dining room, and talk about fire. He was just so angry and upset, and the first instinct from the staff was, oh my goodness, we can't keep him here.
In Des's case, the care workers made a remarkable discovery about his habit of piling furniture high.
We looked at his life history and we found that he was a painter and decorator. And in fact, what he was doing was getting everything, preparing to decorate. He would cover up televisions with sheets, strip off his bed. And so when we looked at that, just understanding what he was doing helped the staff. And we'd have a meeting and sit down and say, okay, how can we help this gentleman? We had paintbrushes and a roller and just some water in a tin. And he was just so pleased to be able to have some sort of meaningful occupation. And it's an important part now of his life.
The panel discussed the importance of meaningful activity.
You could see the wider impact that the empowerment of that gentleman and finding out about his history would have done. The mere fact that he is now happy, you can imagine how that would spread to other people, because an angry person in a home is not easy to live around.
If we think about where it ended, we don't know what happened kind of next for them. But an interesting kind of next step would be to see how far you could take the kind of the decorating activity for this man. You know, so he was relatively able. It's possible that actually he could have engaged in real decorating when it needed to be done.
It also requires the encouragement of staff to do that and to have their wits about them in terms of what they can do to empower
and to be given
and somehow to acknowledge the individuality shown by the worker who found that route, and be prepared for that route to be continued so that it becomes part of the culture of the others in the home.
In Surrey, 40-year-old Lisa has a history of challenging behaviour. Lisa has now learned to use a language of signs and symbols, which enables her to communicate to support workers like Jan her basic needs and desires.
Okay. So Lisa's just signed that she wants a cup of tea in her book. So we'll have to go and get you one, won't we?
Learning this technique makes a huge difference to Lisa's well-being and ability to cope with life.
It means a little bit of independence for her. She's joining her social group. It's better interaction with peers. It also means that she can get what she wants. She can show her choice in all aspects of her life, whether it be an activity or whether it's something as small as choosing her breakfast cereal. If you put the communication in and make sure that she knows exactly what she's doing at any given time in the day, she's a lot easier, she's a lot calmer, she knows what's happening, it reduces the anxiety straight away.
The panel discussed the importance of communication when working with people with severe learning disabilities.
For far too many people with learning disabilities, medication is used to control people's behaviour. Like walking around like a zombie, basically. That's not good, that's not living. You know, that's just existing.
Communication is such an important thing for all people with disabilities and deprivations of various sorts, and how possible it is with someone who doesn't speak. And that is not usually acknowledged. We talk about getting these stories from their carers or from their family, but in fact, you can communicate with people who don't speak. That's excellent.
And it's a good example of knowing, of using their way of, you know, giving them some technology, some means by which to communicate and, you know, to make choices, to be able to show what they want, what they want to do. And this is even the small things like which cereal to have for breakfast, or which, you know, kind of larger activity they want to do. And if you put the communication strategies in place, it has a whole range of benefits in terms of meaningful activity, but as well as choice and empowerment, I think.
Jan knows all about challenging behaviour. Her fourth child, Andrew, suffered brain damage during his traumatic birth. As Andrew reached adulthood, his mother Jan decided the best way to safeguard his future was to take control. Using direct payments, she recruits, trains and manages his entire team. She has studied Andrew's triggers and over time has developed a guide which outlines the style of life that suits him best.
This is Andrew's essential lifestyle plan. It tells us what makes Andrew happy, it tells us what makes him upset, and it tells us what his important routines are. It's a living document. It helps Andrew by providing good information to the people that support him, information that he's not able to share himself because he's not able to talk. And he doesn't necessarily, well, I guess he does know what makes a good day because he's going to be happy. But if you've not seen him have a good day, how are you going to know what makes a good day? There has to be a way of recording all of that rich knowledge and experience, and that's what this plan is.
Andrew's brother Gary helps out whenever he can.
If we ever get up to the chemist in Magnetite, yeah.
Every Friday, Andrew eats out at a local Chinese restaurant where he has his own menu to choose from.
Sweet sour.
Thanks to Jan and the other members of Andrew's team, his lifestyle is busy and his challenging behaviour usually manageable.
Yes, it was.
The panel see excellence in Andrew's social interaction and communication.
I think one of the things that was very powerful about that clip was about this plan, this living plan, that point that was made about a living plan. And that isn't dependent entirely on it being in that particular circumstance. That living plan could happen, could happen in all sorts of different circumstances. And it's a very good way of people communicating about exactly those different preferences and so on. So that empowerment comes through that kind of communication between different people involved in the care.
You know, if Andrew doesn't use spoken language, that's not the be all and end all.
I think you do see that he actually has quite a lot of communication skills, because he is understanding both, I think, through rapport and through situation. But what I thought was the nicest thing was that the waitress didn't ask the brother or anybody else.
No.
She turned to Andrew and she asked him, "What would you like today, Andrew?" So obviously she knows him. It's a familiar environment. And then he showed on his picture menu. So he had a special menu of the things that he liked, and he made a clear choice of what he wanted that day. So again, you see both relationship, you see choice, you see community kind of inclusion. The waitress in the restaurant knows him, and actually she interacted with him.
On one occasion, when I went into the small ward that he was in, one of the nurses said, "He's having his bath. Do you want to come in and help?" In other words, he was a recognition that even in the most personal aspects of Michael's care that I was involved. I mean, I'd been bathing him for months before, so why shouldn't I continue with that now? And they recognise that. Things like that really made us feel that we were being honoured and respected and accepted for who we were in relationship to each other. And so when he died, and that moment when he died, I always remember just pressing that button, which has been my benefit. Sorry, it doesn't usually hit me that. But you said you were there for each other.
I think that's the most important clip that I've seen in recognising the end of life care requirements and needs for excellence to come in. And we've got a long journey there, but there are signs. That's one of them. They know what they're trying to do in involving the closest and nearest to that, into that process. And that's really excellent.
The fact that this person's sort of closest, the person closest to him was able to be involved both in his care and his life as was remaining, it actually has implications for everybody, whether you're in sort of in the aging environment, whether you're somebody with a learning disability.
In order for that relationship to continue to be as good as it was partly about the excellence of care that allowed that to continue to happen.
And here, kind of, sort of different groups of people from society, sort of having different needs and needing those acknowledged and respected. And that's a very good illustration.
When I was given the opportunity of managing my own care budget, one of the great things that came with that was the offer of additional hours of care support wrapped up in that budget, which I would be able to use for purely social purposes. There was a recognition, if you like, that my needs had grown and what mustn't be ignored, as well as the being able to go out and do things. What managing my own budget has enabled me to do is to continue to attend things like theatre performances, concerts, and so on. And I've even gone to the Coliseum, to English National Opera, with my carer. Not only was I getting out and about and enjoying something, but I was also feeling as if I was still part of a world in which I once belonged.
This clip exemplified the idea of service users being in control as part of an excellent approach to care.
He didn't just have the needs of his physical disability, but that he had the needs that were about relationships and social inclusion, for example. And so the fact that he was specifically allowed to have some support to do activities like going to the concerts, going to the Coliseum, etc., was clearly very important for his overall well-being and his overall quality of life.
The two really most important things for people actually are around feeling in control, which is what we're talking about, feeling in control of your life, but also spending your time doing things you value and enjoy. Yes, yes, a personal budget, especially when you've got somebody as capable as he clearly is to manage his own budget and do things exactly the way he wants, is a very good way of achieving that social control. But it is possible in other sorts of settings, and it's a question of making sure that you take into account people's own views in the way that the services are put together or what a particular package of support is put together.
The panel conclude that excellence is achievable if people working in social care treat people as individuals, try to give them control, and work on good relationships.
I think one of the key things that comes across all these videos is the need to focus on the individual and to know about the individual, whether it's their history and what's important to them, or whether it's what they like here and now.
I think the thing that came through to me particularly was about the diversity of ways in which you can give people control. You saw people from a wide variety of different situations, abilities, levels of communication, and so on, and that in each instance people were being given a way to reassert control.
If it really changes for better and people's lives get better, then that's wonderful.
So as you can see in this particular video, we have gone through various aspects of, what is required in order to implement quality, and quality related services within the health and social care sector. Now, I think there are a couple of points which have been taken out in this video, and obviously, the key learning points that we refer to typically include things like why quality is very important in terms of maintaining, the care which is required to be delivered, and it also takes into account, the patient's preferences while delivering some of these services. Now, we also look at how high quality of health and social care services, specifically taking into account the person's background, preferences, and the goals which are set to, as per the care plan, the goals which have been set primarily for these services, to be delivered, meeting the needs of the individual. And then the central role of effective communication that we have seen, which is very critical to making sure that practitioners, people like nurses, healthcare workers, healthcare assistant, healthcare professionals, GPs, doctors, medical staff, administrational staff, which is working within a care home setting, are able to understand the individual. They are able to build relationship, which enables them to, give choices to the people, and that choices which are, these choices which are delivered, given, are primarily meeting the standards which have been set either because of policies, procedures, regulation, acts, which are bare minimum requirements set by regulators like CQC, NICE, SKY, and they help in the delivery and implementation of these standards in a particular setting, which allows care services to be delivered, to a certain standard. And and these standards, when they do not slip and the policies and procedures are followed, which allow staff, workers, contractors, practitioners to deliver the care as per the requirement, allows the patients to get these services, whether it's clinical services, whether it's primary care, secondary care, and this then ensures that a patient is able to get well soon, gets the care they want, and essentially get well soon. Now, with that background in mind, what we'll do is get into some of the assessment criteria that we want to look at. And these assessment criteria primarily when we talk about essentially would be coming into play when we look at discussing the learning outcome in detail in using the assessment criteria. Now, the first one that we look at is an assessment criteria that we're talking about, which basically looks at talking about explaining the standards that exist in health and social care. Now, what are standards? Standards are levels of quality against which performance benchmarks are done. Now, it is essential for us to understand that these are absolute minimum, and they are required to be followed in order to ensure that the care being provided is safe and effective. And the standards are set by key regulatory bodies like Care Quality Commission, NICE, National Institute of Care and Healthcare Excellence. We look at the King's Fund, we look at Sky, which is where I've used the video from. And when we talk about in particular some of these Social Care Institute of Excellence, they are essentially responsible for conducting studies, research, and ensuring that over a point in time, some of these best practices are embodied into policies and procedures, and over a point in time, some of these are set in as standards which help in the improvement of how care services are delivered, how health and public health related services are delivered within a particular setting. Now, there are lots of different standards. What I would also want to do is we are looking at briefly discussing some of these standards in context, to, I would say, looking at understanding, some of these from a point of view of how they are related to health and social care. But what I will also do is look at some of these and cover some of these from a point of view of pointing it out to you, so that you are able to go in and look at some of these standards on the website, which will then allow you to develop a bit more knowledge at your end. Now, when we talk about these standards, I've got one particular slide which basically looks at these slide essentially related to I would say NICE, which is the National Institute of Care and Excellence. And this particular slide, when we look at, also has a bit of a hyperlink, and that hyperlink essentially, talks about the 199 standards which are there, in this particular context, and they are, depending on the settings and the healthcare, let's say, provider or the settings that we have, these standards are then implemented for the purposes of providing services to the members of public. So if I just quickly, share the screen and take you over to the website, because I want to show you, obviously this particular link is available, in the references as well. And you should be able to go across and look at some of these standards, for detailed study. Now, there are, as you can see on the type, I've chosen quality standards. There are some advisory documents, and there are some guidance documents. But obviously, we are looking at discussing in criteria 2.1 the standards which exist in health and social care sector. Now, as you can see, there are standards which have been created over the years for every particular type of treatment the patient would undergo or would be receiving care from the National Health Service. Now, if I look at one particular type, say for example antenatal care, if I click on this is standard QS22. I can download this as a standard to study in a bit more detail, which will be a PDF document. But the brief summary of the standard, how it is implemented, which are the endorsing bodies, and why it is important for us to follow this as a standard, and how it relates to the NHS constitution, the main legislation and acts which the government has introduced over the years, things like the National Health and Social Care Act of 2012, and they are explained in detail on this particular site. So it's a good site to go into. You might be tempted to look at a lot of them, but the idea would be to try and pick out one or two standards, download the PDF, and obviously look at reading into a bit more detail. Although these documents are quite detailed, but the idea would be to try and read through in one of the areas that you feel is something that you are interested in, and that would be useful for you to understand how these standards are created, what are the backgrounds to why these standards are required over a point in time, and then how they are measured and how they are implemented in a particular health and social care setting. Now, if I take you back to the slide where we will discuss them in a bit, like in a bit of an overview, what I would do is here talk about these standards which NICE has set. Now, main purpose when we look at some of these standards which are implemented and then regulated, the main regulator in England and Wales is the Care Quality Commission. Now, this is an independent regulator of health and social care service, adult social care services in England. They are responsible for ensuring that all social services which are, or health and social care services which are provided, which are safe and effective. They take into account putting people's first or person-centered approach, the 6C of care principles. And they are, when I say they're an independent regulator, they have the authority to monitor, inspect, regulate services, and also put, services or sanctions and fines if they find that these standards are not being met. And they even have powers to revoke, your license and restrict these services till these service standards are met. Now, when we look at standards in general being, formed within the health and social care sector, there are 5 key quality themes which are highlighted on the NHS, England website. Now, these themes, which basically are, kind of broad pillars, include corporate leadership and accountability. They include safe and effective care. They include care which is accessible, flexible, and services which the National Health Service provides should be responsive, and the associated parties and, essentially agencies. They should be looking at promoting, protecting, and improving health and social care, and when these services are provided to the members of public. And there should be effective coordination, communication amongst these agencies or multidisciplinary teams when care is being provided, under these 5 broad pillars. Now, when we talk about the standards, we need to be specifically looking at, talking about standards which are the CQC standards. And if I put these across here, what I want to basically mention is there are 16 standards which CQC, makes mandatory for all health and social care settings to meet before they are accorded a license or a license for providing these services to the members of public. Now, they could be hospitals, dental surgeries, care homes, domiciliary services, clinics, amongst other various kind of settings which could be, or organizations which could be providing these services. So, for example, if I take the Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, they have duties which have to be complied with these 16 standards which have been set by CQC, and that is where it allows them to draw government funding and then deliver these services to the members of public in the Manchester, North Manchester or Central Manchester area. Now, the second standards that we talk about is NICE and National Institute of Care and Healthcare Excellence. Now, as I mentioned to you, there are 199 standards which have been set, and there are guidelines, and there are also, advisories which are available from NICE, and these further help in setting clinical guidelines and standards. Public health guidelines, which are essentially given out in the for the benefit of the members of public. So, for example, COVID guidelines, when they were issued, they were public health guidelines like safe distancing, social distancing, essentially of 2 meter. They were public health guidelines given out and created by NICE. We talk about safe and effective guidelines which are given or created essentially as standards which have to be followed when healthcare settings employ staff. Minimum amount of training, their skills have to be looked at, and these are standards that we need to be talking about when we talk about the assessment criteria 2.1, which is standards that exist within the health and social care sector. Now, there are a lot of other standards that we can look at, and these standards tend to be, national and social occupational standards. They also tend to be standards which are coming out of the NHS framework and the NHS constitution. There are also national minimum standards which are set by various other organizations working in very close relationship with the CQC. These organizations include the King's Fund, the Social, SKY, as we call it, the Social Care Institute of Excellence. There are other such bodies like Public Health England, and these standards have to be followed essentially to ensure that health and social care services are delivered which are safe and effective, and the people which are delivering these services or practitioners which are delivering these services are meeting certain guidelines in terms of national vocational standards, which are basically academic standards, skills they need to have, and the training standards that they need to have to be able to deliver some of these services effectively to members of the public. So I hope this particular learning outcome and the assessment criteria is quite clear, wherein we need to talk about why standards exist and who sets these standards and why they're important in terms of providing and delivering these services to the members of the public. Now, the second assessment criteria talks about evaluating different approaches to implementing quality system. Any questions, please feel free to ask me either through the chat route or stop me during our discussion, and we can, take up examples to discuss anything that is that you have queries about. Now, here, when we talk about implementing a quality management system within an organization, it is not generally, it is not very simple to implement, say, for example, a system, of quality management within an organization. Now, it requires lots of different, things when we talk about the implementation of quality and quality related aspects of it, within a particular healthcare setting. Now, there are different ways through which we can understand how, quality can be introduced, or quality system can be introduced within an organization. Now, there are systems like the ISO 9001. There are other systems like total quality management, Kaizen. There is a lot of work which has been done over the years, which basically has established a framework which can be used by practitioners within the health and social care sector, Department of Health, key people within the NHS and other regulatory bodies to use these frameworks to develop their own and tailor and bespoke, I would say, quality management systems for the purposes of ensuring that care being provided is safe, effective, that it is meeting the requirements of the patient, and it is also documented clearly in the care plan, which most of the people involved in delivery of this to the patient are involved. So when we talk about the implementation of these quality management systems, we basically look at ensuring things from 2 or 3 angles. One, we need to ensure that all employees, staff, members, contractors, suppliers working have the same level of organization, and they understand and they have the same commitment in terms of understanding how these systems have to be implemented and followed through when we look at the implementation. Second thing that we look at is in terms of we need to all look at planning, in terms of creating an approach which allows us to put resources behind it. And these resources need to be effective in terms of ensuring that any areas, any gap areas are clearly recognized. And then these are, any resources which are required to plug those gap areas are essentially, taken into account. Now, when we also talk about the implementation, we also look at the scope through which the implementation of these quality management systems can be done. So, for example, we need to clearly define what are the objectives, what kind of standards with the organization we're looking at setting. We also need to look at the buy-in from the senior management so that there is a top-down approach in terms of supporting these initiatives, and these initiatives then would look at the help in the achievement of objectives. And then we also look at the key organizational processes which are set, which are going to be looking at, when I say processes, I mean policies which are available, which will help the individuals when they implement these policies. In implementing these policies, it will help meet the objectives which are set in line with the needs of the customers, or in this case, the patients. Now, within each of these processes, we need to ensure that we have a good understanding of what the commitments are required, what are commitments, what are the requirement on commitments, what are the requirements on customers or patient side, and what we need to be able to look at is how these systems would then be put into some sort of practice, which would help in maintaining and improving these quality standards, which are set in stone by the regulators like CQC. And then if sometimes these standards are not being met, then quality improvements or improvement processes are being, or corrective action plan is being taken into account to improve some of these processes. Now, one such way through which we will look at, what could be the approaches, because we need to discuss some of the approaches. So here we are looking at approaches like SWOT analysis. We're looking at benchmarking as an approach. And then we are also looking at, quality improvement. So 3 such approaches is what we will look at. There are lots of them, as I mentioned to you, approaches like the ISO, Kaizen, total quality management. But in general, what we are looking at is 3 different approaches which would help us in implementing these quality systems within the National Health Service or within the health and social care setting. So one of them being quality improvement. Now, this is an approach that focuses on the process of care, and it emphasizes on the standardization of processes which are required for providing the care to the patient. Now, this approach is based on the notion that if people are working to the same standardized process, errors can be easily detected and corrected. That is the essence of this particular, approach. Now, we also look at that sometimes it becomes extremely hard to detect an error because we get used to the individual ways of working. And this then tends to be a limitation, because sometimes we use the term, we need a fresh pair of eyes, because when people get used to the system, sometimes you look at making mistakes and they are not, recognized as mistakes and are rather seen as usual, methods, usual processes. But essentially what happens over a point in time is because they become so accustomed with carrying out these processes in a certain way that sometimes mistakes cannot be easily identified. So as an example, when we look at people in older ages which have multiple conditions, and if one such condition does not get recognized or gets overlooked, then it can be fatal, because the severity of the condition and the outcome of that severity could lead to patient losing its life. And in this case, sometimes what you have to do is, the standardized quality approach does not work, because in those cases, what you will need to look at is individual care being, individual plan being put for any such condition which can be critical or fatal to the patient's life. So sometimes when we look at quality improvement approach as a process, although it has its advantages, but it can also have disadvantages, with certain set of customers having multiple underlying conditions, or conditions which typically tend to be if they are overlooked can become fatal and can lead to loss of life. The second process that we talk about is SWOT analysis. Now, SWOT analysis tends to be identifying strengths, weaknesses, looking at opportunities and threats, which, over a point in time need to be streamlined primarily for the purposes of ensuring that, quality does not slip. Now, in this approach, we are looking at identifying what are the key strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and in particular the staff, and what could be the areas which could be prone to threat if standards are not met or if standards are overlooked. So in this case, when we talk about, weaknesses in particular, the approach here is to look at breaking the, implementation down into internal factors and external factors, which can positively or negatively impact the implementation of quality systems within an organization. So here, when we talk about internal factors, it could be factors like staff training, it could be factors like equipment, maintenance of equipment, infrastructure, administrative, facilities, and they could be internal factors which are within the control of the organization. External factors could be factors which are beyond the control of the organization. So when we look at the COVID pandemic, it affected a lot of care homes because There were things like shortages of PPE. There was no certain, cure or vaccine available for the condition. There was a shortage of, I would say, oxygenators in some cases, and some equipment, which could not reach on time because the demand suddenly peaked over a short period of time, ensured that the care homes could not provide the required amount of care, and it led to fatalities or a lot of people losing their life, both on the care worker side, hospital staff side, care staff side, and also patient. So external factors could be factors which are beyond your control, and they will need to be regularly monitored to ensure that adequate supplies are maintained when implementation of systems related to quality is, are concerned. Now, external factors could also mean that sometimes organizations would need to look at making changes to their existing setup or their requirements because the external conditions have changed. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of makeshift hospitals, which the government created in London, Birmingham, and Manchester, were done in order to ensure that there are enough beds available to accommodate patients should there be requirement. And that meant that some of the facilities which were created were done because of the peaking in of the virus and the population, in certain areas, say, for example, where these hospitals were created, were done primarily to ensure that enough beds are available and oxygenators are available, essentially to provide, treatment to patients should they contract COVID. The third approach that we look at is total quality management. Now, TQM, when we talk about the approach of total quality management, we basically talk about this approach because, this means that we are looking at a continuous process of detecting and reducing errors or, issues which can typically be, faced by staff. It could be faced by contractors, suppliers, and that would hinder in some way the implementation of processes, and as a result would lead to compromise in services being provided to patients or patients who are requiring care. Now, in this case, the key focus is on the customer, which is the patient. And when we talk about total quality management, there is a focus on continuous improvement. The plans that are drawn up are flexible, and they are done in a way wherein if the standards are not being met, the plans are adjusted so that there is a continuous process of making improvement as the care or treatment is being delivered. So this is something that we can relate to, I think, quite easily, is because sometimes what happens is when patients are given medication, and if you're not responding to medication and you're not getting well soon, the doctors would then readjust or relook at your medication. They will look at your medical history, they will look at your records, and obviously look at prescribing or changing your medication to ensure that you're able to get better. So this particular process of where we look at continuous improvement, and when we look at continuous improvement, we look at continuous improvement to ensure that the standards are being met. When I talk about standards, what I mean by that is the standards are being met primarily in the case of health and social care services being delivered, and the focus being on continuous improvement. So in these cases, when we look at sometimes because of economic conditions, external pressures, when organizations are not able to meet the quality standards, then in order to cover some of these gap areas, incremental corrective action plan are prepared, which are flexible, and they can be updated so that the goals which are set by regulators are then achieved when it comes to delivering some of these services. Now, this particular plan approach, when we look at, has to have a buy-in from staff. Everyone needs to participate because they all need to be looking at understanding that improving quality of care is not a one-man task. It is a team task. So the whole organization from top to down has to approach this in a way wherein everybody understands the meaning and the aims and objectives of why quality and quality standards are set in the organization. Now, We also look at, certain aspects of TQM in particular, wherein we basically look at the idea of ensuring. When we look at the background in history, TQM talks about when it originally originated in Japan, it was maybe in the manufacturing industry, car manufacturing in particular, when this concept came out in the 1950s. It was TQMs, basically was looked at from a point of view of time, cost, and quality. So if time, if any of these, are compromised, time or cost, then you would generally see that there's an effect on, how quality of the product or the type of product can be delivered. So this particular aspect of total quality management also has 8 principles. And if I look at 1 or 2 quick slides to explain, why this is implemented within organization, is when we talk about continuous improvement, we are looking at putting a systematic approach in place, which allows us to focus on the needs and requirements of the patient, and then ensures that all goals and objectives are aligned with the key regulations to deliver some of these objectives for the patients. And there are 8 underlying principles when we talk about TQM in general, and these 8 underlying principles include, they include customer focus, they include total employee involvement, it includes the process which have to be followed. So the improvements, when we look at making and implementing these policies, are focused on the process side of things. Sorry. To ensure that, even the suppliers which are providing, inputs in terms of raw materials, or when we look at, multidisciplinary team within the National Health Service, and some of the partners and suppliers working very closely in tandem with the National Health Service, hospital, for example, providing these services, they all have to align to the same processes and have the same policies to be followed. We also look at integrated systems. As we look at the early 2000s, the NHS embarked on implementing a coordinated or a centralized IT system, which is, made accessing of patient records, their medical history quite, I would say easy. And this is primarily when we look at talking about integrated systems like ISO 9001, 27001, which are implemented within the organization to ensure that everyone has the access to the information, and that information is used, as a central theme to provide some of these services, or look into some of these services which are delivered to patients within the National Health Service. It talks about, continuous improvement. It talks about fact-based decision-making, and obviously clear communication and guidelines, which are crucial for ensuring that, standards are maintained, and, care standards being maintained means that the services do not slip, and they are delivered to the requirements of the patient. So in general, when we go back into this particular assessment criteria, different approaches, we need to talk about 2 or 3 different approaches, because it's about evaluation, and we are looking at quality improvement, SWOT analysis, benchmarking, and one of the ones which I've used theoretically to talk about is total quality management, which is, explained in, and the 8 principles of TQM have been explained in the subsequent slides. So any questions, please feel free to ask me. The last assessment criteria that we want to go across is to look at, potential barriers, which could lead to, which could basically create drawbacks or, compromises in the delivery of care being delivered to, patients, in particular, when we talk about health and social care sector. I have taken an example of the Vidyansha Hospital here in terms of looking at, talking about and explaining some of these potential barriers. Now, what could be these potential barriers when we talk about, in delivery of the health and social care services? Any thoughts on this in terms of when we talk about potential barriers that could, be faced within a particular setup? So in general, if you think about, say, barriers first, what could be barriers, which we generally have? So barriers could be lack of resources. It could be lack of, support. It could be financial, resources. It could be trained staff. It could be, lack of leadership. These are all barriers essentially when we talk about, when you come across the potential barriers. Now, we have come across this particular bit a number of times that the NHS is currently cash strapped. There's a shortage of resources. There's shortage of nurses, trained doctors, and healthcare workers within the NHS. Now, all these to a certain extent are barriers because inadequate staffing, staff with not the required skill set, or staff not having adequate training and the skills required to be able to deliver on their role on a day-to-day basis, would all be contributing towards creating, defects, or essentially services not being delivered to a certain standard when talking about patient care. So they will all be termed as, I would say, barriers. Now, when we talk about, overcoming these barriers, they can be overcome by training, by making sure there is a proper resource plan which is available, both in terms of human resources, administrative, financial resources. You would also look at this being, let's say, supported by leadership. That means there's a buy-in from the top leadership, essentially, when any particular plan has to be put into action. There is good communication across different channels. And when we talk about the National Health Service and health and social care sector, there are lots of agencies, partners, suppliers, contractors, different types of practitioners which work together to be able to deliver these services to the patient. So good communication and team working are requirements essentially to ensure that delivery of health and social care is done to a certain quality standard as prescribed by the CQC. Now, when we talk about these potential barriers, we need to be able to take an example, because here it talks about analysis of potential barriers. So my suggestion would be to take an organization in mind. And what I've done is I've gone into within your hospital's website, which is there as one of the references. And what you can do is go into the hospital website, look at downloading the CQC report and the rating, and then look at reading into some of the reasons why the regulator has asked the hospital authorities to put, corrective action plan in place. So if I look at sharing the website with you guys for a minute, this is the website of the NHS Manchester University and NHS Foundation Trust. Now here, if you see the CQC rating on the homepage of the hospital is good. When I click on this particular rating, you'll be able to go in and see the latest inspection report. And here, the point that we need to pick out on is obviously they are providing safe and effective care. Their care is outstanding. They are well led in terms of their leadership. But one of the areas which is given as amber is that their responsiveness to meeting, say for example, certain conditions, is amber. That means that requires improvement. Now here is where what we will look at, what are the potential barriers which are essentially not allowing them to be responsive. And what I would suggest in this case would be, if you go into further details and I look at what are the potential barriers there, when we talk about potential barriers, urgent and emergency services in the case of Withinshire Hospital requires improvement. Now this, if I go and read, will give me the potential barriers which are impeding the delivery of quality of impeding the quality of services being delivered by the hospital. So for example, their planned staffing levels are not consistently achieved. That means there's a shortage of staff. So this is a potential barrier. Now the staff which they have, even from contracted agencies, sometimes might not be meeting the requirements in terms of training. their documentation on safeguarding information against adults and children is not consistent. Now, during the inspection, obviously, the CQC found that there were lots of workstations which were unattended, which could have been accessed by patients. There were not security features put in place to ensure that you know, logins or machines could not be accessed by customers, and they could be you know, let's put it this way, there could be systematic failures in terms of not ensuring that data of patients and data within the hospital premises is kept safe. So they now these could be potential barriers, because what could be potential barrier in this case? Staff is not adequately trained. That is one barrier. The staff which is working, maybe contractor staff which is working, does not understand the systems which have to be used, and their negligence could also be while using the systems we consider a potential barrier. Then when we look at staffing levels, when we look at wait times, you know, which are given here, typically could also be barriers, because that would mean that the staff is not able to meet enough patients or see enough patients during a particular shift. It could mean the waiting times on ambulances and A&E could increase because the staff is not able to, you know, let's say, go through the number of patients which are required by following the standards which have been set. It could be because of inconsistent practices and processes which over a point in time have not been monitored and have not been reviewed, which are leading to less productive you know, time and also inefficiencies in the system. Now, these could be termed as barriers that we need to discuss here when we talk about you know, barriers. So in broad sense, I would say there are lots of barriers, but broadly, when we talk about barriers that are there within the health and social care sector which impede the delivery of quality services, you know, include lack of resources, lack of staff training, lack of funding. It includes lack you know, not the buy-in from the management isn't there. And then we are looking at poor communication and systems and implementation of these systems from an infrastructural point of view, and they tend to be the barriers that will impede the delivery of quality services within any particular health and social care setting. So I hope with this particular you know, session, you've understood the learning outcome 2 in a great amount of detail. There are some readings, additional readings, which I would suggest that you need to go ahead and do. There is a good article on total quality management. I would suggest reading a particular report for, say, for example, the Midlands Hospital, which will help identify, you know, what are the barriers which could be potential barriers impeding the quality of services being delivered by the hospital. And then one of the standards which I would suggest that you, out of the 199 which are there on the website of NICE, which is the National Institute of Care and Healthcare Excellence, I would suggest read one of the standards in a brief, you know, briefly. If you want to get into the details, download the PDF and look at that, and that will help you understand this particular learning outcome in a lot more detail with clarity of what we've discussed in regards to you know, NHS. Now, one last thing which I'll also look at is when I talk about, you know, barriers, I'm also going to be uploading a particular article which is from the Health Foundation, and I'll briefly show that to you before we close the session. And this particular article talks about specifically barriers, you know, which are impeding the improvement within the National Health Services. So when I look at these barriers, essentially this particular handout, although it's about 28 pages, but what we need to be able to do is start from page 6, what we already know and what's happening in the NHS, and then it will give you a good idea in terms of what are the potential barriers which the National Health Service is essentially facing and how the NHS is looking at putting a plan in place to overcome some of these barriers so that the quality of services being delivered to patients is not compromised. So if you read this particular article, it will give you a very good understanding on the assessment criteria 2.3. And with this, I will bring the session to an end. Thank you so much for joining. As always, all the material that we have looked at today, including the video, the presentation, and the recording of this would be available on the YouTube channel. So you should be able to essentially go on to our YouTube channel and see today's session, which is going to be under the live section. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email at learnerwork@ukversity.co.uk. And I'll catch up with you next week where we discuss the learning outcome 3 for the same unit. Thanks for attending, and bye for now.